So a case challenging the NFA and its restrictions on SBRs is now in front of the Supreme Court and is heading for Supreme Court conference. But with Congress recently passing the $0 tax on suppressors and SBRs in the Big Beautiful Bill, this case is now likely going to change. So let's break down what is happening. Now, before we jump into this video, I just wanted to mention that if you guys want to support the channel, right now we have a free legal guide available for you guys. It's free to sign up. All you have to do is put in your email, and all of that is also going to be housed over on my website, armscholar.com. You can head over there. I will also leave a link down below to the free legal guide where you can sign up. But over on the website, we have that legal guide. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're going to be talking about an important NFA challenge case that is now in front of the Supreme Court and how things are about to change because Congress recently passed the $0 NFA tax. This case we're talking about is U.S. versus Rush, and it's a challenge to the NFA and its SBR restrictions. This challenge asks the Supreme Court to find that the NFA's restrictions are in fact unconstitutional under the Second Amendment. The petition also focuses on how the Supreme Court needs to finally step in to correct all of these lower courts and the confusion about what type of arms are protected under the text of the Second Amendment. In this case, the Trump administration recently sent a notice to the Supreme Court, and they waived their right to respond to the petition, and they said that they're only going to respond if the Supreme Court asks them to do so. Now, in response to that, the Supreme Court docket now indicates that the case is heading for Supreme Court conference, and that's going to happen early next term of the Supreme Court on September 29th. However, this challenge may now change and potentially hit some potential roadblocks because of Congress passing the $0 tax through the Hearing Protection Act and the Short Act and those zero tax versions that were included in the Big Beautiful Bill. So we need to talk about how this case will change and kind of how the landscape of these NFA challenges on suppressors and SBRs and this specific case, Rush, which is in front of the Supreme Court, how this is going to change in response to what just happened in the Big Beautiful Bill. Now, for those not aware, in this case, Mr. Rush was charged with possessing an unregistered short-barreled rifle in violation of the NFA. Mr. Rush argued that the NFA's restrictions and those requirements actually infringed on the Second Amendment, and therefore that charge against him should be dropped. Mr. Rush has now filed a petition to the Supreme Court asking for them to reverse the lower court decisions and find that the NFA and its SBR restrictions do in fact violate the Second Amendment. The question presented to the Supreme Court on the petition is whether the Second Amendment secures the right to possess unregistered short-barreled rifles that are in common use for lawful purposes. In the petition, the NRA argues that since the Supreme Court issued Bruin, courts across the country have struggled to answer the many questions resulting from the court's new analytical framework. In particular, the debate as to what constitutes a bearable arm covered by the Second Amendment has revitalized in relevance. This case presents several issues that are dividing lower courts and is a suitable vehicle for the court to clarify what arms the Second Amendment protects. So one of the interesting things to note about this specific case is that although it deals with SBRs and the arbitrary restrictions on those types of items and those types of firearms, the challenge also seeks to essentially have the Supreme Court clarify what other types of arms are covered by the text of the Second Amendment. And that would be important because it would also impact other lawsuits and other issues like state rifle bans and state magazine bans. The petition argues that the Second Amendment protects all bearable arms, including short-barreled rifles, which are in common use for lawful purposes. It challenges the Seventh Circuit's interpretation of SBRs as non-arms under the Second Amendment, and the petition asserts that short-barreled rifles are in common use, and they cite to statistics showing that there's at least 532,000 registered SBRs within the United States. The NRA also criticizes the Seventh Circuit for dismissing evidence of their widespread lawful ownership and use. Now, in the end of the petition, they asked for the Supreme Court to grant cert to resolve these issues and provide guidance on the scope of the Second Amendment and what protections SBRs should get and whether or not they are protected arms. Now, like I mentioned, in reaction to this, the United States government, through the Solicitor General John Sauer and the Trump administration, that gave notice to the Supreme Court that they are waiving their right to respond to the petition. Now, after that notice was filed by the Trump administration, the Supreme Court docket now indicates that the case is heading to conference, and that's going to happen early next term on September 29th. Now, just because it's set for conference does not mean that the court will not now request a response before the conference or even, ask for briefing and some additional information, after the conference date. Now, all of this developed before we got any additional information on the Big Beautiful Bill and the HPA and the Short Act. Now, a lot of this is likely going to change because the HPA and the Short Act and the $0 tax version recently passed in the Big Beautiful Bill. As many of you know, over the last few weeks, There was a big battle in Congress to get the NFA's restrictions removed completely and get them removed completely for suppressors, SBRs, SBSs, and AOWs. Unfortunately, what ended up passing in the Big Beautiful Bill was only the reduction of the tax from $200 to $0. However, that has now opened the door for new challenges to the NFA, and recently GOA filed a lawsuit in a federal district court in Texas, and that was done in conjunction with FRAC, Palmetto State Armory, Silencer Co., and there's also going to be some other lawsuits that will be launched by other organizations as well. Now, in that case filed by GOA, the plaintiffs asked for the court to declare that the NFA's registration and transfer requirements, which pertain to the now untaxed firearms, SBRs and SBSs and suppressors, that exceeds Congress's enumerated powers. And because now there is a $0 tax, Congress does not have the authority to regulate and register and track those firearms. They also asked for the court to enjoin all the ATF's employees and agents from implementing or enforcing the NFA against those now untaxed firearms. The main thrust of the challenge that was filed by GOA is that the NFA's registry enforcement mechanisms were built on the foundation of the NFA being a tax. So a new challenge based on the NFA's modified language under the Big Beautiful Bill has been launched. However, you still have this rush case in front of the Supreme Court, and it's heading to conference. That means that a few things could happen now in this challenge. First, the Supreme Court could ask for briefs and additional supplemental information and responses to clarify how the new NFA language alters this case and how it should proceed forward. The other option is they could simply find that the petition is now moot because the NFA language has changed. There is a $0 tax, and so they could kick this back down to the lower courts for reevaluation in light of the changed language. There's also a high likelihood that the court denies this case after the conference and maybe clarifies that the lower court needs to reevaluate this case based on the new NFA language. So as you can see, this is a very dynamic situation now since the NFA's tax on SBRs and suppressors has now changed. The downstream impact to that is now that a lot of those cases that were pending, which challenged SBR restrictions, suppressor restrictions, and other NFA restrictions, those are now going to need to be modified, and the courts are likely going to kick those and ask for a new evaluation based on the changed language. It's going to be interesting to see how the Rush Supreme Court case kind of is impacted by that change, and potentially what happens in other cases as well, like the Peterson suppressor challenge that's currently in front of the Fifth Circuit. So we're going to see how this develops. It's also going to be interesting to see how the Trump administration actually responds to the petition if the Supreme Court asks for additional responses. I suspect if that happens, what we'll see is the Trump administration might respond in a similar way that they did in the Fifth Circuit, Peterson challenge, which dealt with suppressors. Maybe they're going to argue that the NFA and SBR registry and those restrictions are still constitutional, but maybe they're going to say that they agree the Supreme Court needs to review and resolve the issue of whether or not, SBRs or potentially suppressors and other items are protected arms, because that's one of the big issues that developed at the lower court level. So again, a very dynamic situation. We're going to see how this develops, but a lot of this is going to be up in the air now because of that NFA tax language change that happened with the Short Act and the HBA being included in the Big Beautiful Bill. So as we get more information, as this develops, I will let you guys know. As always, if you guys want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that, of course, is to subscribe to the channel, and then also check out my website, armscholar.com. You can check out the free legal guide. You can check out the merch we have, the daily deals, and then also, check out the new channel that we opened up, the Arm Scholar Armory. You can check that out where I do reviews and all of that. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget, this nation was built by Arm Scholars, and this nation will be maintained by Arm Scholars.